Dennis, don't make any rash decisions. Okay, relax, sleep on it. We'll talk about it tomorrow. Okay, George. Art isn't easy.
Hey,
Even if you're smart, you think it's all together. Something falls apart.
I know this piece is very special to you, and you've said it's a bucket list piece. What makes this piece what should make this piece a bucket list piece for our community to come and see?
This piece is about the process of making art. There's a portion of the musical that's dedicated to the putting it together of art. Community to me is a word that describes theater making. We require a vast group of artists to all come together to build something. When we think of painters, I know when I think of painters, I think of how lonely it might feel to be by yourself with your canvas, for example. But when we're putting on a show about a painter, it takes dozens and dozens of people to spend months and months preparing to put something on that an audience only sees 2.5 hours of. And that's what excites me. And when I thought about, okay, who are these people that I want to work with to put this together, I thought I want to populate the team with as many of the dots that are special to me in my life and get them all in a room together and have fun with it. And the vast majority of the group involved with putting this together is someone that I've worked with in the past or someone that has ties with El Paso. And it makes me really proud that I was able to not only do this bucket list show for myself, but to bring a bunch of people that I've been itching to work with again, or that I thought would work well together for the first time in a room, and have our community see a reflection of themselves on the stage while they're watching these characters.
How did you and Luis meet?
I've known Luis for quite some time. In fact, I became a theater artist late in life. It wasn't until after college, and I was dabbling in community theater and finding any outlet locally. And so I found my way at the UTEP Dinner Theater, like so many of us in the market. That was what kind of opened our eyes to what theater is. And I remember getting cast in a show where Luis was the lead. We were in Miss Saigon together. And because I worked with so many people at UTEP and Luis was training at UTEP, we had 1,000 mutual friends. And over the years, as both our careers have grown outside of El Paso, we still have a network of El Paso friends that keep us bumping into each other constantly. Weddings every year, births of children, parties, all that kind of thing. And so it's really awesome to do it. And we were thinking about it, and it's technically the first time that we're both doing a project on the big stage together with El Paso Opera. Over the pandemic, I invited Luis to help us come up with something to offer digitally to our community. And so we had a big recital that featured Luis. We went to New York and recorded it and then streamed it. But other than that, this is the first time that we're working with each other as performer and director.
Yeah.
That's exciting. And I know that several of your friends from that era are in our show as well. Which ones are those?
Billy Gilbert, who is one of my closest friends. He's playing Louis and Dennis.
Mallory Cade is our assistant stage manager, and she's a big part of our friend group.
Josie and us, both of us go way back. Who else from that old school group?
Oh my gosh, it seems like we have ties with almost everybody. But yeah, definitely Billy. I even strategically cast Billy in the friend role of Louis, so they have a special scene at the end of the show, so that all of us who know their relationship behind the scenes can kind of revel in that scene with them.
That's so awesome. I think people have often opinions about opera that they think that opera is elitist or only for a certain group of people or only for people who dress a certain way or spend a certain amount of money. And of course, this is not technically an opera, although it is very operatic in scope. But I hope that people will understand from our camaraderie here and all that this is very much for everyone, and you don't have to dress a certain way. And tickets right now, actually, there's a buy one get one at 50% off. You can get tickets for a very affordable rate. Well, what else makes this something that's so compelling for your average El Pasoan? What do you think?
I think to just go back and talk about opera being elitist, I think there, when you look at all of these standards, and we're having the conversation these days of, are these standards, like your Carmen, your Barbara Seville, and all these shows still relevant? We're still struggling with the same societal issues or whatever, same personal,
People are still people.
People are still people.
Yeah.
So in that same realm, I think that's what makes Sondheim so brilliant, that Sondheim isn't interested in giving you characters that are neatly wrapped in a bow. Sondheim writes shows about life and how life happens to people. And before studying the show, Sunday in the Park had been kind of the one who fell through the cracks for me. I'm a big Sondheim fan, and for some odd reason, Sunday in the Park was the one that, from an outsider's perspective, seemed a little heady. And once I actually started studying it, it's, in my opinion, it's the best thing he ever wrote. It is the most human thing he ever wrote. It's just, I don't know that you can go see Sunday in the Park and not relate to somebody or some kind of situation on the stage. That's the brilliant part of Sondheim. He's going to make you relate to something or someone. It's not elitist, or it's not exclusive in that way.
Speaking of representation and seeing the El Paso community represented on the stage with, of course, lots and lots of native El Pasoans and Warensians, I was thinking about a conversation we had the other day about the character of Georges Seurat, the painter, who, again, created this exquisite and very heady, if you will, work. He might have been neurodivergent. Mm-hmm. We were speculating that the artist was able to create this such focused, detailed work, was unable to focus in a way that was satisfying for his love interest, Dot. And we see his struggle with social niceties, mm-hmm. and being able to communicate effectively. And I wonder if you wanted to talk a little bit about that, Justin. How do you see the character of Georges in that way, and how might our neurodivergent friends that come to the show see themselves?
I think there are two schools of thought. One is that the more specific we are in the art that we create, the more sort of universal it can be received. But what's interesting is that I feel this piece gives us enough of a spectrum of glimpses into the relationships and the minds of the characters that there will automatically be an opportunity for anybody to see themselves in practically every single part. Mm-hmm. So even for someone with a specific identity or a specific background, such as neurodivergence or a class background of some sort or a nationality of some sort, even though this painting is set in Paris in 1884 about this particular painter, I'm not sure that we are specifically saying, okay, that person is doing this and saying that and wearing this because of this specific reason. Mm-hmm. In fact, we're looking at it in the rehearsal room and we look at the painting. So Avery's sitting right under Dot, which is the character she plays. But even though we see the painting there, we don't feel like we need to make sure that every single aspect of what's on the painting is represented on the stage, because there's such thing as artist liberty. Mm-hmm. And so I'm having fun imagining with my performers, looking at, well, when did what George was looking at and sketching evolve to become that? It's not, he didn't paint all this in one sitting. Mm-hmm. He didn't pose every single one of these people in this tableau and then sketch it out. He did this over a series of months, and he looked at each individual person in isolation and then put them all together, which is kind of, I think, a metaphor for what we do and what the audience sees is we don't know how it's done. We see the final product, but then that makes us think more about how it was done.
Yeah, it's not a snapshot. It is a collection of experiences, like you said, that he witnessed over months, and people that made impressions on him, and that he put together to kind of, this is his life and his perspective of life, rather than just a scene that he sat and painted in one sitting. So that's
or imagined.
Right, and that is amazing. And who was it that mentioned the other day that 48 people in this painting and none of them are looking at each other? That was something that I found very
No eye
interesting.
contact. Yeah.
Whether it comes from Seurat's mind, if it was deliberate or if it was accidental, that there's no eye contact between any of these people, which that
And
just
yet many of them are
fascinates me.
grouped together as couples. You might
Exactly.
expect that they would look at each other.
That's just such a very interesting observation that I think speaks a lot to the artist's perspective and his view. We get insight into who he is looking at it that way. It's fascinating.
Yeah. Speaking of insights, I know a lot of our regular audience for El Paso Opera is used to going to the Carmen's or the La Traviata, which we did last year, or even Frida was more operatic in terms of the vocal style, although Frida did blend more popular styles in with the typical classical vocal style. So this is divergent, to use that term again, for you guys. I mean, I know that you both have had experience doing musical theater, but most of your career is straight up opera, correct?
Correct.
So what's it like to do this? What are the differences in the way you prepare, in the way you're going to approach these roles vocally?
Well, I had a lot of help from giving a shout out to my coach in Madison. His name is Thomas Kastorf, who is a Sondheim aficionado and geek. And I think the bigger challenge, the range presents an issue.
We know Mandy Patinkin originated this
Patinkin.
role, and his voice is much higher than yours.
Yeah. I sing Escamillo and things that are baritone to bass baritone. But Justin had the foresight of saying, this isn't opera, and it's mic'd. And you have had musical theater experience singing stuff that was much higher, and you sing the Barber Seville, and looking at it on paper, it struck me. I had listened to it before. I had listened to Mandy's performance, and I looked at it on paper. I said, it's actually not as high as I thought it was, just because Mandy Patinkin's voice, it makes it sound so much higher. Of course, there are parts that on the paper look intimidating, of course.
Daunting for a baritone.
Daunting is the right word. But it's funny, I think, having Thomas guide me through that process and just give me permission to say, just, why are you singing this so much? Is that it's Sondheim, is that it's still beautiful, it can still be beautiful, but it's not in the same style. You don't have to work as hard. You're mic'd. So deliver the thought and deliver the text and trust that your voice is going to know what to do. So that's that. A lot of it has been that, just having permission to do something different outside of the confines of what I traditionally do. But yeah, I've kind of surprised myself a lot in this process of the things that I've been able to do vocally that feel good and healthy. I haven't really felt like it's a stretch as much as I perhaps thought it would be.
Yeah. I want to hear Avery's response too, but now I'm thinking about something else. There's many people in town I know who are super excited to see this musical, and because they love musical theater, they love Sondheim. They may not actually be opera lovers. So I wonder how many of them are sitting out there going, well, I don't want to hear an opera singer sing a musical. What are your thoughts on that?
I used to be a teaching artist and I loved going to schools, and I would ask the students, raise your hand if you've been to an opera. No one. Raise your hand if you love opera. No one raised their hand. Raise your hand if you think you don't like opera. And then some would start raising their hand. And I'd ask, well, how do you know?
Because you haven't seen it.
You haven't, so there's already this idea of what opera is, even for people who don't go. So then I would follow that up with, okay, on the count of 3, students, I want everyone to make your voice your impersonation of an opera singer. Ready? And I go 1, 2, 3, and the full 100% participation of people going, oh, and I'm like, okay, so how do you know what opera is? You've never been. There's an idea of what it is. For me, opera, and one of the reasons why we chose to do Sunday in the Park with George for our 30th anniversary season is that it is not about the sound or leaning into a tradition that exacerbates what people think about opera. Really what it is it's an excuse for getting a bunch of people who have dedicated their lives to studying music and putting on a story on a stage for an audience. And this gives us the same everything that you need to do. You have to spend as much time learning the parts. You have to spend as much time worrying about your voice and thinking about the balance with the orchestra. You have to think about what you're wearing and where you're standing, all the same things that we do. But for those people, I would say this is much shorter than many of the classic operas. This is not in a foreign language. This is not from 100+ years ago. This is only a 40-year-old show that feels like it was written for today. It is very much what you would expect from something entertaining, but it's also in its scope operatic because of the themes and the demands musically are really profound. Yeah.
It's a show that really relates that if you're an artist, and not excluding opera singers, that you as an artist really can relate to these characters. So in that way, it is very operatic, and it's, opera singers are just as obsessive as George Seurat was about the technicality of every little thing, and we know exactly what it is like to feel like we're spending all of this time on just this little thing and how to perfect it and how to get it, and then the whole other spectrum of putting art together. I think the opera industry is very well acquainted and aware of how hard it is to put art together, and how it's not just about the art, how it has all of these other things that you have to worry about. You can't just be an artist and say, well, now I go do my art, because we're dependent on so many other variables to put it together. So it's
Bit by bit.
bit by bit.
Dot by dot.
Dot by dot.
Speaking of dot.
To answer your previous question about the vocalism and the challenges that presents, I shared in our first rehearsal the other day that I grew up loving musical theater. I loved Sondheim. I never really was like a nerd about Sondheim, just because I think I was more exposed to the Golden Age musicals and just things like that. And so that's actually what I grew up loving to sing. And which then I found opera specifically when I was 17 or so, and fell in love with that. But so I kind of like bypassed Sondheim a little bit. So this vocally is an entirely new, more or less, ball game for me, because there's belting in this show.
Sure.
That I have sung a few different more contemporary musical theater pieces individually that requires belting. That's been fine, but it's been like, 2 or 3 lines of belting versus a whole role. This is my first Sondheim role. A whole role where you figure out where you should belt because of an emotional reason or an acoustical purpose or whatever it is. And so it's been a very interesting and quite frankly fascinating technical journey for me to take the information. I really worked so very hard in school to like really get my classical technique as ironed out as I could. I won't say perfected because it's never perfect, but I really spend so much time and effort learning about my technique and my voice and how it works so that I can use it to kind of morph myself into many different repertoires. And so now this is kind of like the biggest test of my technical understanding of my voice up to this point, to be able to use those tools in a very different way. So when I first started working on using this concept of belting, it was funny, I apologized to my family. I was like, as I practice this, it's probably gonna sound bad. But it has to sound bad first so that I can find where the right place is for it and where where it feels good and healthy. And so experimenting with finding what felt right and what felt comfortable and the different vowels, like it's all so specific and some might say obsessive as far as the very specific details of how we produce sound, the physics of phonating and all of that. And so it's really been, I truly mean fascinating when I have been exploring this role and learning about my voice. And I think in a lot of ways, I will be able to take what I'm learning here and actually take it back to my opera singing and
Absolutely.
like strengthen my chest voice in the repertoire that I sing and stuff like that. That it really translates across the board, and it's so much fun. Sincerely, it's fun to work on the vocal process of this role, aside from everything else.
One of our colleagues that's not with us today is Dr. Matthew Mailman, and he's from Oklahoma City University, where he has been the conductor for 20 years, maybe over 20 years. But Oklahoma City University is known for two very specific things, not things, but women, Kristen Chenoweth and Kelly O'Hara. So if you know Broadway, you know those two names. And what distinguishes those two women, aside from just their general fabulousness, is that they both sing opera as well as Broadway and musical theater. And so that to me sort of ties in together a bit of what we're doing. We have someone from that tradition of training singers to do both. And at UTEP and many other universities around the country, we're really focused on making sure that the singers, the musicians that come out of the School of Music are 21st century musicians. And what that means to me is that they are versatile. They can do a variety of styles. They can show up with great creativity and flexibility of mind to tackle whatever tasks are at hand, because most opera companies are now doing what Justin is saying, which is see the work. Opera is an Italian word for work, as music and theater.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be limited by the vocalism, the particular style of vocalism. So we in America, think of opera as classical singing and musical theater as a different style, but they are still music theater.
Yeah.
And we can do it all.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
But even Sondheim blurred the lines of what opera and musical theater were. You listen to night music, and it's hard to argue that night music is a musical. It's hard to argue that at times that Sweeney Todd is a musical.
Right.
So you're talking about a composer who really just knew how to straddle that line and was just focused on, is this opera, is this musical theater? That didn't matter. Is this a work that is relatable?
Yeah.
And he was trained by Rodgers and Hammerstein. He was an assistant and protege of Hammerstein's for so long, and that music is also very much, is this opera, is this Broadway?
Right.
And so there's a whole tradition of blurring the line purposefully.
And let's not forget Leonard Bernstein, with whom Stephen Sondheim did West Side Story. Leonard Bernstein's works are classic blurring the lines between that classical sound and the, we'll call it Broadway sound.
Over the years when sometimes music was becoming more and more produced in the opera house, the press would often ask him directly, is your work a musical or an opera? And he finally just became famous for responding, if it's being performed by an opera company, it's an opera. So that's what we're doing. I don't think I've yet to say that this is an opera or this is a musical. I think every time I've described it or said what I'm doing, I'm saying I'm doing a show, or I'm doing a bucket list show, or we're doing this production, or I'm doing Sunday in the Park with George. I don't think I've ever
Specified.
Yeah, I don't want to push any kind of agenda into leaning one way or the other. And I feel like what we're doing in the room too, we find ourselves steering the rehearsal process sometimes in an opera tradition, and then sometimes in a theater tradition, and then sometimes, so we're not pigeonholing ourselves so that we can make it uniquely a version that we're proud of.
Best of both worlds.
Indeed.
And making something brand new, like this painting. Okay, one word. Why should people come to see Sunday in the Park with George? Why should they get their tickets today?
You guys go first. One word.
It's profound. Good word.
I was gonna say deep, which is the less fun version of that.
Synonyms.
Oh man.
Monkeys.
Cream puff.
Cream puffs. Oh my. We have, speaking of cream puffs, this is a show about, it's set in France, right? So Dot, spoiler alert, Dot leaves George for Louis the Baker, and he announces to her, I brought your favorite cream puffs. So I brought cream puffs from my favorite bakery in town, Bella Cora Bakery on the west side of El Paso. And once we finish our little discussion, we'll each have a little bite of these big as your head cream puffs from Bella Cora.
Such a gigantic.
So to sum up, monkeys, cream puffs, profound.
Spot the dog.
Spot the dog. Spot the dog. All dog lovers need to get their tickets today. Thanks for joining us. We hope to see you at Sunday in the Park with George at the Abraham Chavez Theater on May 17th and or 18th. You're welcome to come twice. It's at 7:30, Abraham Chavez.
Bye.
Bye.
Cream puff.
Cream puffs.